electrical action potential. Time is roughly a little shorter, so they're not quite as long. And this is the one right, if I can find it right here, the green graph. And this is supposed to be my representation. ALR in kindergarten, so we'll have to live with it. But basically the plateau phase isn't quite as pronounced, largely because there's less expression of L-type-calcium channels, so it's not as big a plateau. As I said somewhere along the line, for decent coupling, the calcium coming through L channels is about 50%. The rest comes from the sarcoplasmic reticulum for contraction. But it has most of the other channels. It does have the inward rectifier to generate the resting potential, which is roughly minus 85 millivolts. It does have sodium channels. Very weak expression of the transient channels. ITO, the initial one, gives that sort of little notch. But pretty well everything else is there. But the expression levels are different. Because the atrium, although it contracts, is not part of the pumping system. Or not an important part of the pumping system. The other thing I'd like to mention, and we'll come back to that again, is in fact, if you look at the type of electrical activity here in the septum to the wall of the left ventricle, the actual action potential going from, say, the interior endocardial surface to the epicardial, the other side, there'll be different kinds of electrical activity, slightly different. And that has to do with repolarization of the cells. So they're slightly different. That's been demonstrated many times. So what the kind of action potential you see here will be slightly different from the one there. Now it depends on the kind of ion channels that are expressed in these cells. So we're going to do, for a quick run through the electrocardiogram. So basically, when these cells, when the heart is activated from the pacemaker, we get activation of various parts of the chambers. And basically, the actual activation is sometimes referred to as a dipole. And it's like taking a 1.5 volt battery in a bucket of saline salt solution and moving it in one direction. It would actually generate a voltage that you could pick up externally. And that's just showing this as you're actually, as the negative parts depolarize. This is the stuff that's polarized in the opposite direction, this travels in one direction. You'll generate currents, large currents. And the heart is a fairly big organ, a lot of cells, and a lot of ions move. So the extracellular movement of ions, as you see in nerves, is large. So engineers, physicists, in the 70s, thought this was a really major thing to look at, so they did modeling. And if you look at an action potential, this one being in the atrium, when you shift from minus 85 to something positive, you get about 100 millivolt change. That's a fairly decent change. So this is basically the idea that you can model this biophysically, looking at sort of conductance of the body, how well the lungs transmit electrical currents or whatever. And you have to consider all this, and you can actually say if there's a 100 millivolt change at the level of the atrium, you can pick up a couple of millivolts roughly on the surface of the skin. So that's based on the fact that the body is conductive, salt solutions on the other side is conductive, and you can generate the currents that are generated by the heart can be detected roughly at the surface. This is about 100 years old. A guy by the name of Waller in Britain about 100 years ago showed that you can detect the activation of the heart on the surface using electrical recording techniques. poor Waller died, and about 30 years later, a Dutch scientist invented a device that gave you a time resolved the time better. And his name was Einthoven, and he actually received the Nobel Prize for the electrocardiogram. He didn't discover it, or invent it, as I like to say, but he basically received the Nobel Prize for making an instrument that could actually measure it clinically. So it became useful. So, this is the simplest sort of appraisement. You can put some amplifiers together, and you can buy splitting electrodes. This is called a bipolar electrocardiogram. It's the simplest form of the electrocardiogram, which goes back to Einthoven and Waller. And basically, it's the two arms, and there are various lead configurations. This is lead one. It's the two arms, and one of the legs is ground. Or the lead two is the leg, one of the arms. And of course, there's lead three. We'll be talking a little bit about lead two. Now, you eat 2 pizzas and drink 4 beers, you get heartburn, and your mom takes you to the emergency at the University of Alberta Hospital. They do something a little more complex than that. They do the 12-lead electrocardiogram. Because chest pains are always a suggestion that you might be having some sort of a myocardial or a heart attack. Anyway, you do 12 leads, and that gives you different views of the activation of the heart. But we're not going to bother to do that. If you do 404 in physiology, then of course you'll get a lot of this. So I won't bother with that. But anyway, you can look at these, and these are the changes that occur during the actual activation of the heart, starting at the pacemaker and ending up at the ventricle. Now you can look at many things. Enlargement of the chambers. You can look at problems with damage to portions of the ventricle or the atrium. Or, what we'll do is look at timing. See if something goes wrong with the timing. Something is blocked, it doesn't conduct properly. So we're going to do a very simple approach. And the way it works really is just to look at this. If you have this strip of muscle, cardiac muscle, this has been shared out in frog tissue and turtle tissue because it lives really well in salt solution, a little bit of oxygen. The measured tissue doesn't live very well. So all you need is some sort of a voltmeter, measuring positive and negative areas. So when the strip of muscle is static or not depolarized, not activated, you get 0, no voltage change. If you activate the strip of muscle, you're going to get propagation from this area to this area here, and as you go from here to here, then you start to generate a voltage change. This is due to the fact that this thing is generating extracellular currents and propagating in this direction, the polarizing direction. And of course, if it goes all the way, then you go back to 0. So they're all depolarized and it goes back to 0. Now, the kind of signal you get depends on the orientation of the electrode. And that's why the 12-lead electrocardiogram going is used. So you can look at different aspects of the activation. If you reverse the electrode, so that you now make this one negative, then of course the thing goes negative. So that's dependent on the orientation of the electrode and the direction of propagation of this dipole. So this is in fact another dipole going from this direction or from this direction to this direction. So it's like taking a 1.5-volt battery, getting a bucket of salt water and just moving it, and you can actually generate a voltage change like this if you want it. Just very small, mind you, but it would be there. So that's sort of the basis of what we're looking at. And if you look at the lead 2, which is, just to go back here to show you what I mean. This being lead 2, left arm, right leg. It is just this lead 2, and the reason I picked that is, in fact, some of the flexions are felt a little bit larger than they are in lead 1 or lead 3. And they have the same sort of orientation. So I'm just using one, and this is the reason for that, a little larger. So you have signal something like this. This is a very schematic representation. If you go and see your sick aunt in the hospital, it's not going to look like this. It's going to look a little different because they use, in hospitals for monitoring, they use different lead configurations. This is sort of a classical look of an EKG in the textbooks. So you have something called a P wave. Sharp deflection, which is called a QRS complex. And the last one about these sort of a slow activation called a T wave. And there's a bunch of segments in interval. This is the PR interval. Ends right there. In Europe, it can be called the PQ interval. And there's the ST segment and the QT interval. And somebody actually wrote a third paper on long QT syndrome, which is part of it, which is what they're measuring here, which is quite interesting. Okay, so that's the EKG. What does it do? The P wave, this guy here, is caused by spread of depolarization. Now it's a spread because basically, if you look at this, although I haven't shown it, this is time. So basically, the initial depolarization caused by the pacemaker occurs here, and this is the spread of the actual activation of the atrium with respect to time. So it's a spread of depolarization. It's not just a simple one shot. So that's the P wave. The other one, the very large one, the QRS complex, or the QRS deflection, is caused by the spread of depolarization across the ventricles. That's sharp upstroke. And the thing to note there is the time is very quick. So the ventricles are activated compared to the atrium are activated very quickly. So the time is very short. Much shorter than a P wave. So this is very quick. Because they have the Purkinje fibers, they conduct very quickly, and they activate the ventricles very quickly. And that's the whole idea of cardiac activation. You want the ventricles to be activated, bang, so the things can trap, do their thing, pump the blood. Now the last one, last but not least, is the T wave, and that's due to the repolarization of the ventricles. It's actually the ventricles coming back to -85. So it's the repolarization phase. Now, looking at the EKG, you don't actually see a wave or a deflection that is due to the repolarization of the atrium. The atrium has to repolarize. Any ideas why not? There's two reasons.
Is it masked by the QRS?
Yes, it's masked by the QRS complex. That's one thing. What's the other reason, do you think? I'm sorry?
Very fast.
No, not particularly. Think of the mass of the tissue. So the atrium is really small compared to the ventricles. So the signal is tiny. You can actually deflect it if you do couple of cute things, or if you just separate the ventricles from the atrium. You wouldn't want to do that in a human, but you might in an experimental situation. It occurs there, it's very small because the mass of the atrium is very small. And the repolarization phases are, because it's slow, it's actually slow, the signal is a lot less. So it's a tiny little signal there somewhere. So that's the ECG. And basically it's related, as it shows here, to the actual activation of the chambers by starting at the pacemaker. So this is an atrial action potential, a little better than the one I drew, but the resting potential is a little higher than it should be. So that gives you the P wave. So this is all the P wave. And starting here, should be roughly on the same time scale as the deflection caused by the polarization of the ventricles. So these action potentials, these only show one action potential, but it's a spread of these action potentials. So, you know, the first cell activates and then it keeps on going until it's completely activated. Okay, there's a bunch of intervals which are interesting. First one, of course, is the PR interval. This consists of the spread of the polarization across the atrium, conduction through the AV node, and the common bundle of his and the bundle of branches of the Purkinje fiber. Because the first reflection is the actual activation of ventricular tissue. So the PR interval consists of a lot of things, not just simply depolarization of the ventricles, and it includes the conduction time through the atrioventricular node. So the atrioventricular node time is part of it. So the PR interval, the time interval from the beginning of atrial depolarization to the beginning of ventricular depolarization. And so the heart rate should be about 60 per minute, should be about 0.2 seconds or less. Increasing the PR interval is suggested that there's something wrong with the atrioventricular node conduction. And that's all it uses to measure. So this interval is increased during any block or inhibition. So something that actually slows conduction down to the AV node will increase the PR interval. That's used as a measure. But it includes the thing you don't see, of course, in the pacemaker cells is just too few. There's only about 5,000, as I told you. So you don't see that occur right at the beginning. And most of that deflection is due to the actual activation. P wave is actually activation of the atrium. Not current comes out of there that you can actually measure. And it consists of everything else. AV node, bundle of his, bundle of branches, and Purkinje fibers. The other one is, of course, the duration of the QRS complex. Varies in individuals, of course, a bit, 0.06 to about 0.1 second. And if you have increased time, suggests that something is wrong with the normal stereotype conduction pathway. Something is missing. So you may be activating the ventricle through an additional pathway or directly through ventricular tissue. So these are, of course, important for these measurements. And of course, the QT interval, The QT interval corresponds to the period of ventricular repolarization. It's around 0.4 seconds. Increased heart rate decreases it. If you have problems with, as I suggested, some of the potassium channels repolarizing the ventricle, you would increase the QT interval. And there are, of course, mutations in sodium channels and potassium channels in muscles, which actually make a long QT interval gives you long action potentials. That then ends up in causing all kinds of electrical disturbances. So, but normally it's in that range. So that's the time for repolarization. Anything that affects potassium channels and repolarization will increase the QT interval. If you're normal and you exercise, of course, it goes down because you get a faster heart rate, so it shortens. Here's some examples. This basically looks at timing and alterations in the normal conduction pathway. So these are just simple examples. For example, this one here shows you that the SA node is working. You get a sort of a reduced conduction with the atrioventricular node. You're taking too much muscular, for example, to do that. You're eating too many bananas with the potassium concentration up, your blood goes up a bit. Or you're exercising on a treadmill down until you actually fall off the back of the treadmill. Potassium goes up. And the reason potassium goes up is when you're exercising, because all your muscles are working, you're polarizing all the nerve cells, but more importantly all the muscle cells, and the actually metabolic demands cannot keep up. So that happens, and potassium is around 3 or 4 millimolar in normal human, but you can actually, there's a study from Sweden that says that if you exercise somebody until they fall off the back of a treadmill, potassium will go up to about 6 or 7 millimolar, so double. And that, of course, will affect conduction through limited conduction pathways. If you eat a ton of bananas, you might do it too, but I haven't seen that. Anyway, they basically increase the time to prolonged PR interval. It's a little longer than 0.2 seconds, suggesting there's something wrong with the atrioventricular node. The other one is the height where you actually sometimes call a Mobitz 2 or something block. This is just called second degree block on this slide. And basically you have a normal P wave, QRS complex, T wave, another P wave, but something's happened to the AV node. And it doesn't conduct, so you have another P wave, but you miss ventricular activation. So if you miss ventricular activation, your atrium is firing away at 60 per minute, and your ventricles may be going at 30. Not a good way to go. And people who can't reverse this pharmacologically end up with things such as pacemakers. And pacemakers, they've now changed artificial pacemakers because at one time all they would do was stimulate the ventricle. And that sort of demonstrates that the atrium is not a big player in pumping. And people live fairly well, but now we have demand pacemakers, which allows you to run up a flight of stairs, start a fight with George Laroque or something, whatever you want to do. Anything that requires severe energy. So you can do that. But anyway, this is a situation where the ventricular rate would be too low. And that's due to the fact that we have a complete inhibition of transmission to the AV node, sort of intermittent. Now you can actually get a situation where you get no conduction to the ventricular. So the rate then becomes ventricular. And this is such an example. Complete block at the AV node, nothing gets through. So you get regular P waves because the atrium is working along nicely, and so the pacemaker. And basically the atrium and ventricles contract independently of each other. Because remember I said that the pacemaker gives you the highest rate, but there's about 1 to 2% of tissue or cells in the cardiac chambers that are prepared to do the pacing under the right circumstances. And the right circumstances usually mean a lack of oxygen. So if the ventricle is not receiving appropriate oxygenation, then of course cells like to be polarized, and some cells will take over and start to pace. So that's what's happening here in the bundle of His. And basically, you've now changed the way the thing looks. You have still the QRS complex. It's a lot lower because the inherent rate is slower in these tissues. And so the P waves and the T waves sort of jump around a bit. This is the QRS complex. This is probably a T wave. Another T wave. Another T wave. Totally random compared to this one here, or to the normal one. Now, the other kind of thing I want to talk about is the actual disruption of the normal conducting pathway. This still has part of it. You have a Purkinje fiber system still active. What happens if, in fact, you get a block here, a complete block, and you get a pacemaker set up in the ventricle somewhere? It could be a Purkinje fiber, or it could be actual ventricular tissue. So, as I suggested early on, that the QRS complex gets longer because a normal conduction pathway is bypassed. The heart is being activated through ventricular tissue, not through the Purkinje fiber system. And you have regular P wave because the atrium is still happy, pacemaker is still happy, but this is longer, and you then have sort of random activation, and the T wave becomes inverted. The T wave in ventricle, if you look at sort of in a little more detail, because of the way the signal goes, it goes from positive to negative, it's repolarizing. You would expect in a normal EKG T wave to be negative. But it's not, it's always positive. In this case, it starts to become negative, and that's because in this case, the cells that depolarize first in the ventricle repolarize last. So it goes in the opposite direction. Ooh. That's this diagram here. So this is complete depolarization. It's going in this direction. Once it's repolarized, it starts to repolarize from here. So these cells repolarize first, but they repolarize last. And that is due to the fact that the action potentials in this portion of the ventricle are quite different in terms of time and expression of ion channels and the other ones on the epicardial or the outside surface. They're different. So this is what happens in the last case. If the repolarization travels in the sort of normal direction that you would expect and tends to become negative. So that's in fact what occurs in this situation. So the whole thing is not working well. The ventricular rate is very low, probably a third of the normal rate. And again, this is a pacemaker required intervention. So you have to pace the ventricles or pace both. Depends on what you want to do. If you're 37, you probably want to have an expensive pacemaker. The straightforward one, which just paces the ventricle, is about $20,000 bucks. So that's why Allison Redford and all the government people worry about healthcare. All of us are getting older. You guys are still okay, but a guy like me, well, I could be hitting you for $25,000 coming out of your pocket. Very expensive. But it's important. These people will come life. Because in fact, if you do get to the situation where you're hitting ventricle contracting about 30 per minute, you do a lot of sleeping if you're still alive. Anyway, one thing I want to bring up is important in ventricle, and this is something that you're probably aware of, maybe. Refractory periods. You've heard of refractory periods? What are refractory periods? All experts on nerve, muscle, muscular and passive when we talked about skeletal muscle.
Just resting periods where the fiber can't elicit another action.
Correct. What does it do to largely?
Would it be just too much hyperpolarization?
What are sodium channels? What are sodium channels? How do sodium channels actually act? I'm sure Dr. Moran mentioned it. Yes? I'm sorry? Yeah. You say- So they come inactivated. Okay. So I think you all pretty good on that. You know, a little shot, that's fine. Okay, so during a ventricular action, the cardiac muscle cell cannot be reactivated because of the refractory period. There are two of them. As there are in nerve and skeletal muscle. There's something called, well, since it's cardiac muscle, cardiologists like other names, I guess, something called the effective refractory period. The effective refractory period is also known as the absolute refractory period. And it's primarily due to sodium channel inactivation. So the sodium channels fire, and they can't fire again for a period of time. There's a difference. And of course, there's another refractory period called a relative refractory period. During the relative refractory period, a strong stimulus, superthreshold, can produce another action. And that's something you actually should have had in nerve and Dr. Moran, I'm sure, if you remember. But it's important. In nerve, but it's also important in nerve, it actually limits the number of action potentials that you can actually send in terms of information transmission, right? If there was no refractory period and action potential nerve lasted 0.1 milliseconds, you could have a much wider bandwidth and send more information. You could learn this stuff faster, that kind of stuff. Okay, so this is roughly the refractory period, the absolute, and the relative. And the absolute refractory period in muscle, in cardiac muscle, lasts not a fraction of a millisecond as it does in nerve, but it lasts 200 milliseconds, at least. Why is that? The sodium channels that cardiac myocytes express are very similar to the sodium channels expressed in nerve. So there's one little thing that I'm sure Dr. Moran may have not even bothered with because it's not important in nerve. Is the actual reactivation process of sodium channels is time and voltage dependent. Makes sense. But basically, not much sodium in this thing here because the voltage is fairly positive, long action potential. Sodium channels will not reactivate, they're voltage dependent. The reactivation process is voltage dependent. So until it comes back roughly to where it should be, minus 85, you can't turn on any sodium channels. So this is an example of a normal action potential in the ventricular cell, and then sort of trying to activate it sort of in a relative period, and eventually we get back down to the normal resting membrane potential to get a full-blown action potential, although that's not shown. And so that's why it's long, because the reactivation process is long. This one here, of course, you have high, the relative largely high sodium or potassium conductance in addition. But you can activate it. The problem with activating cells in this region, or activating in this time region, is you get very slow propagating action potential. You don't want that in cardiac muscle. You want them to be normal. So you get really slow action potentials, and that's an issue. So if you get some of these guys trying to propagate, you cause what are called arrhythmias. So you hope you never get into this. And the idea behind this is you want the action potential that goes, whatever ventricular cell or Purkinje cell, to always be the maximum. You don't want none of these little shrimpy guys going through, but they conduct very slow. And you know from nerve, if you change the sodium channels so they don't activate very quickly, you can do that pharmacologically, the conduction velocity changes. Because it doesn't depolarize the adjacent areas as fast as it should. It takes time, so that adds a little time to it. We want, this is the situation in ventricle and also atrium. So long contraction period and a two, and they're important physiologically. You gotta have it. If they become one of these funny little guys tries to propagate, they tend to be a little bit of sodium and a lot of calcium. Calcium action potentials propagate very slowly. Arrhythmias. I'm not going to spend much time on that. All kinds of arrhythmias in the heart. You're studying for the exam on the 18th, midnight, and you haven't looked at it yet. You're drinking 12 cups of coffee. Lay down in bed at 2 o'clock in the morning and says, yeah, what the hell about this cardiac stuff? I didn't really want to know it. And all of a sudden you get these sort of palpitations or premature ventricular contraction. That's an arrhythmia. A lot of us get it, not a big deal. So don't drink too much coffee. Cut it off at about 4. All right. The other type of sort of very simple one is atrial fibrillation. Could be due to anything. For example, pulmonary artery sometimes starts to cause problems. It's not usually fatal because the atrium is not really all that crucial to contraction. The problem with the atrium, and that happens in old aunts and grandparents, they get atrial fibrillation fairly common. Either you have another pacemaker that tries to take over, or some damage to tissue, even a viral infection will try and generate another rhythm. And atrial fibrillation gives you very quick depolarization of the atrium. It by itself is not a big deal. However, what is the problem with atrial fibrillation, and it gets a lot of our senior citizens, is you have these little auricles on top of the atrium, these little chambers. Blood pools in it, and it does what Dr. Barton told you with blood pools, coagulates. So all of a sudden this atrial fibrillation, which is not a big deal, when the clot breaks off, lodges in your brain, and the next thing you know, you're waking up somewhere in the Royal Alec or General, and some nurse is feeding you. Get strokes. Well, that's one of the causes of strokes. Atrial fibrillation can be dangerous from that aspect. There's ways of overcoming that, of course, and you can find another pacemaker that shouldn't be there. It's trying to work. You burn it out with the radio frequencies. That happens. Pharmacological means usually sometimes work, but pharmacology isn't always the answer. So it's not usually fatal. Ventricular fibrillation, when you get into ventricular fibrillation, and that's caused by, for example, electric shock. If you're having sitting in your bathtub, studying physiology, obviously, and somebody comes and talks your radio into the bathtub, it's connected to something by accident. the AC circuit will cause you to fibrillate, ventricular fibrillation. Unless you have a defibrillator handy, you don't have to worry about the exam. All right, so it's usually fatal. One of the examples that's used to cause atrial fibrillation and works very quickly, if you happen to live in Texas for a while and kill a couple of people, end up in Huntsville, give you a bit of sedatives so you're not screaming, and then give you a shot of potassium chloride, and it causes ventricular fibrillation, and that's it, end of the road. Not a good way to go. A little painful, I'm told, but somebody suggested it. No experience. But anyway, that's fibrillation, ventricular fibrillation. And you see a dog, somebody, an animal that's been shocked to give you atrial fibrillation. And I don't know how many of you are fishermen, but if you ever get a bunch of fishing worms and you look at the can that they're in and they're all kind of squirming around, well, that's what the ventricle is doing. Kind of like a bunch of worms squirming around. It's not, no contraction that can pump anything. And that's what gets you. It doesn't pump blood. It's random contractions. The other thing, you get ectopic beats sometimes, as I suggested, the coffee. Now, if you get a lot of them, you could be predisposed to this sort of fibrillation. But most of these things are, for example, abnormalities in the duration of the excitation, something that happens to the pathway, or something called re-entry. And that's when you get a circular movement because of some damage to a portion of one of the chambers. Now, this is sort of but anyway, these are some of the things that can actually cause various arrhythmias. One of the things I showed before, the Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome, where you have the AV node, and you have another accessory little strip of muscle that binds the two chambers together. So the excitation, and if that is a very good pathway, you can actually cause rhythms of disturbances that could actually predispose you to some sort of fibrillation or arrhythmia. That strip could be actually part of the AV node, and if that's the case, that's not usually all that serious. Damage. You lose blood supply to a portion of the ventricle. The ventricle dies, it gets disconnected, and of course you've got to conduct around it somehow or other, and that can cause some sort of a problematic activation that can cause an arrhythmia. The other things that are kind of useful, of course, are not useful, but can be a problem. Long action potential. That's the long QT syndrome. So what happens then is you have an action potential and then it sort of oscillates a bit, and that's due to the reactivation of calcium channels. So that you don't repolarize properly a long action potential. So that's called a long QT syndrome, and it tries to reactivate sort of without the pacemaker and the conducting pathway. So you can cause an arrhythmia. Drugs. When you have long QT syndrome due to drugs, for example, I mentioned digitalis, that's acquired. The other ones, of course, genetic. It can be genetic or acquired long QT syndrome. And I gave an example of one of the potassium channels that repolarizes ventricle always has to be tested by the Food and Drug Administration to see if they've come up with a new antibiotic whether it actually blocks this channel. If it does, you get acquired long QT syndrome. So that's one of the things that's very crucial. And of course, excess calcium. And there's actually a gentleman in Calgary that works on the fact that you get too much calcium in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It accumulates too much calcium. And once in a while it dumps some calcium. So you get these late after depolarization, which causes activation of portion of the chamber, like the ventricle, before the pacemaker does. And I think I remember what his advice to us in the last seminar was, if you want to live a long life, and not have any of these problems, first rule, choose your parents. Second rule, don't get too excited, ever. So, but to choose your parents is a really important one. It's not easy, but it could be genetic. So, I don't know if you can do that or not, but maybe you should. And the last one, which I forgot, avoid your cardiologist. They give you drugs. And I think that's probably a shot. Yeah, this is just example. These are just examples of a couple of things. Atrial fibrillation, a lot of contraction. You don't see any aortic activation. Sometimes the ventricle response, sometimes the EAD load is refractory, and it doesn't get through. So if you have atrial fibrillation and no contraction of the ventricle, these are the two rest problems. This one here is actually, this title is incorrect. This is ventricular tachycardia. That's just before fibrillation. And if you want to see the actual progression, I actually think this is from Huntsville, Texas. You have a normal sinus rhythm, T waves a little elevated. You have ventricular tachycardia, which is sort of looks like a sine wave, and eventually you get this random movements of polarization, which is chaotic. This would still pump some blood, also pump nothing. Okay, we'll start on some of the mechanical stuff and the plumbing next week.